Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tales, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps keep the stories coming. Hospitals at night have a silence unlike anywhere else. It's not the kind of peace you find in the countryside, and it's not the stillness of a sleeping city. It's heavier, stranger, filled with faint beeps of machines, footsteps echoing in the halls, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that seem to flicker a little too much after midnight. For years I worked the night shift in one of those hospitals, and though I saw countless strange things, nothing prepared me for the patient who never slept. Her name was Martha, and while many people whispered about her insomnia or blamed it on dementia, I came to believe something much darker was keeping her awake. And once you hear her story, you might understand why even now, years later, I sometimes find myself lying awake in the middle of the night, afraid to close my eyes. Martha was in her late 70s when she was admitted. During the day, she was quiet, even cheerful at times. She would eat her meals, chat lightly with nurses, and occasionally smile when family members came to visit. But the visits never lasted long. Her relatives seemed uneasy around her, as if there was something they didn't want to acknowledge. At first, I assumed it was the usual strain of dealing with dementia, but I quickly noticed Martha's nights were nothing like her days. She refused to close her eyes. She sat up in bed for hours, staring at the same dark corner of the wall. Not at the door, not at the window, but at one specific spot, as though something only she could see was waiting there. Whenever a nurse urged her to rest, she would shake her head and whisper, "I can't. If I sleep, he comes closer." We thought it was confusion, maybe a symptom of her illness. But there was something in her tone that was different. It wasn't the disjointed rambling of someone who didn't know where they were. It was the trembling certainty of someone who was being hunted. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I'd grown too tired from long shifts, and I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But then the first incident happened, and it shattered the calm routine of our ward. It was close to 2 a.m. I was doing rounds when I heard a faint scraping sound coming from Martha's room. It wasn't the sound of a chair moving or someone shifting in bed. It was sharper, like metal dragging across tile. I rushed inside, expecting to find her tangled in equipment, but the sight that greeted me froze me in place. Martha was on the floor, her frail hands gripping a kitchen knife she must have swiped from a food tray earlier. Her eyes were wild, pupils dilated, and she was pointing the blade toward the empty darkness of the corner. "Don't let him touch me," she screamed. "He waits when I close my eyes." It took 3 of us to calm her down and wrestle the knife away. She was sedated and placed back in bed, and the incident was written off as a dangerous but explainable outburst. But I couldn't shake the image of her trembling in the shadows, clutching that knife with every ounce of strength she had left in her old body. For days after, I kept seeing her eyes, wide, terrified, unblinking. Soon after that night, strange reports started to spread among the staff. Some claimed they heard whispers when passing by her room, low and muffled, as though 2 people were talking in hushed voices. But Martha was always alone, and her TV was never on. One nurse swore she saw a shadow move across the wall while Martha was fast asleep. Others refused to go near her door unless it was absolutely necessary. I dismissed it all as paranoia, but then one night I heard it for myself. I was delivering medication when I paused just outside her room. At first I thought someone inside was speaking, but the words were indistinct, like voices traveling through water. I stepped in quickly, and the whispers stopped instantly. Martha was sitting upright in her bed, her gaze locked on that same corner of the wall. When our eyes met, she didn't look surprised. Instead, she said in a low, steady voice, "Do you hear him now?" My whole body tensed, and I felt the air grow colder. I wanted to say no, but the truth was, I had heard something. Things escalated on the night of the blackout. It was just past 3 in the morning when the entire hospital was plunged into darkness. The power went out without warning, and though the backup generators kicked in, the hallways were cast in a dim, sickly orange glow. Alarms beeped faintly in the distance, and the silence grew even heavier, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I rushed to check on patients, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, until I reached Martha's room. What I found made my stomach drop. Her bed was empty. The sheets were tangled on the floor, and the door was left slightly open. My first thought was panic. An elderly patient wandering through the hospital during a blackout was dangerous. I started down the hall and eventually spotted her standing perfectly still at the far end, right in front of a locked window. Her thin frame was bathed in the faint glow of emergency lights, and in her hand I saw something that made my blood run cold. She wasn't holding a knife this time, but a long, rusted nail clenched so tightly that blood dripped down her palm and onto the floor. I called out to her, but she didn't turn. Instead, she whispered, "He's closer now." I can see his hands. I wanted to move toward her, to take the nail away, but the way she spoke made me hesitate. Her words weren't frantic, they weren't confused. They were calm, resigned, and absolutely certain. I took a step forward, and at that moment the lights flickered back to life. Martha dropped the nail, her shoulders slumped, and she let me guide her back to her bed without resistance. She never mentioned it again, but the image of her by that window haunted me for weeks. 2 weeks later, her condition took a sudden turn. Doctors debated transferring her to a psychiatric facility, but before that could happen, everything spiraled into the most terrifying night of my career. It was around 4 in the morning when her alarms went off. I rushed into her room, bracing myself for another dangerous outburst, but what I saw was worse. Martha was gone. Her bed was empty, monitors disconnected, and the door locked from the inside. No broken glass, no forced exit, nothing. Security was called immediately, and footage was checked. But there was nothing. No one entering or leaving her room, no movement in the hall. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. For days, investigators searched the building, but they found no trace of her. Her family demanded answers, but we had none. She was declared missing and her case quietly disappeared into hospital records. Yet the strange part was what came after. Even after the room was sealed off, staff swore they heard whispers when they walked past at night. Some said they saw shadows shift against the closed door. Eventually, that entire wing of the hospital was shut down. Officially, it was for renovations, but among the staff, everyone knew the truth. Martha had never left that place. It's been years since then, and I no longer work night shifts. But I think about Martha often. Her eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling when she said he came closer each time she shut her eyes. I can't help but wonder if she was never truly delusional at all. Maybe she was being hunted by something we couldn't see. Something that comes in the silence when we surrender ourselves to sleep. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake in the small hours of the night, I find myself staring into the dark corner of my own room, waiting. Because if Martha was right, then maybe the reason she never slept was simple. She wasn't just afraid of nightmares. She was afraid of what was really there when the rest of us closed our eyes. When I first moved out of my parents' house for college, I was desperate for independence. The campus dorms were full and apartments in the city were far too expensive for a student like me. So when I found a small 2-bedroom place with rent I could actually afford, I didn't hesitate. The only catch was that I'd have to share it with a roommate. His name was Rob, and at first glance, he seemed perfectly ordinary. Maybe even too ordinary. He was quiet, polite, always paid his half of the bills on time. He worked late hours at a job he never talked about, and when he was home, he mostly stayed in his room. At first, I figured I had lucked out. Most of my friends were dealing with nightmare roommates who partied too much, stole food, or never cleaned up after themselves. Rob wasn't like that. The apartment was always tidy, he never made noise, and he even watered the houseplants without being asked. For the first month, I thought I had struck gold, but slowly little things began to bother me. The first odd detail was the way Rob kept his bedroom door. It was always locked, not just when he was out, but even when he was inside. If I passed by, I could hear faint noises sometimes, not music, not a TV, just movement, pacing maybe. I told myself it wasn't my business. Everyone has a right to privacy. But one night, when I came home earlier than expected, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. His door was cracked open just a sliver, and through that narrow gap I saw him standing in the middle of his room, staring at a wall covered with photographs. The photographs were all of me. At first I couldn't process it. My brain refused to accept what I was seeing. It had to be some kind of mistake, a trick of the light. I quietly backed away, pretending I had seen nothing, my heart racing so hard I thought it might give me away. For hours I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But the next day I noticed one of my notebooks was missing, and when I finally found it, it was back in place with pages I didn't remember writing on. Scrawled across the margins in handwriting that wasn't mine were my own name over and over again. I tried to shake it off, but my nerves only grew worse. Sometimes I would feel his eyes on me when I wasn't looking. Sometimes I'd find the kitchen window unlocked even though I knew I had locked it. Once I caught him standing in the hallway outside my room in the middle of the night. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled faintly and said, "Sleepwalking, I guess." His tone was calm, but his eyes didn't match the words. They were sharp, focused, and I felt like I was a specimen under a magnifying glass. I thought about moving out, but I didn't have the money and I didn't have proof of anything. If I told anyone, what could I even say? My roommate is too quiet. He looks at me strangely. He might be keeping photos of me in his room. It all sounded paranoid, and maybe it was. But the feeling in my gut told me I was in danger. Then one night, the danger proved itself real. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when a noise woke me up. A soft clicking sound like the turn of a lock. My bedroom door creaked open slowly, and in the dim light from the hallway, I saw the outline of a figure step inside. My breath caught in my throat as Rob's shadow moved across the floor. He was holding something in his hand, though I couldn't see what it was. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, every muscle in my body screaming. He stood there for what felt like forever, watching me. I could hear the faint rasp of his breathing. Then, just as suddenly, he turned and left. The door shut, the lock clicked, and I lay frozen until sunrise. The next morning I confronted him, trying to sound casual. I asked if he had come into my room during the night. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You must have been dreaming," he said. but his eyes held mine too long, as if daring me to push the issue. I didn't. I packed a bag that afternoon and stayed with a friend, claiming I needed a change of scenery to study. When I came back a few days later, the apartment felt different. Too quiet, too still. I went into my room and found my drawers slightly open, my clothes rearranged and my pillow turned upside down. Rob's door was shut and locked, as always. I never saw what was inside that room again. Eventually, I managed to break the lease and move out. It wasn't until months later that I stumbled across his name online. Rob had a record. Multiple restraining orders filed against him by women who claimed he followed them, watched them, collected their belongings. Reading those reports, I realized how close I had come to becoming another one of his stories. To this day, I can't sleep without locking my door. And even then, sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I imagine the sound of a lock clicking open, and I wonder if somewhere, someone like Rob is standing in the dark, watching. When I was a kid, my grandparents' house always made me uneasy. It wasn't haunted looking, nothing like that. Just an old two-story place in a quiet neighborhood. It had peeling wallpaper, creaky wooden floors, and the faint smell of mothballs that clung to every room. But what really unsettled me was the window in the upstairs hallway. It was tall and narrow, with glass so old it distorted whatever was on the other side. During the day, it showed nothing unusual, just the overgrown backyard with its rusted swing set and the edge of the woods beyond. But at night, that window became something else entirely. I hated walking past it. The first time I saw her, I was only 8. I had gone upstairs to grab a book I had left in my room. The house was quiet, everyone asleep, and as I tiptoed down the hallway, I made the mistake of glancing toward the window. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a shape standing outside. A woman. She was pressed against the glass, her face pale and blurred by the warped pane, her eyes two dark hollows staring straight in. I froze, gripping my book so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then I blinked, and she was gone. When I told my grandmother the next morning, she scolded me gently, saying I had too much imagination, but the way her expression tightened told me she knew something more. My grandfather, on the other hand, avoided the topic altogether. Whenever I brought it up, he would change the subject or suddenly remember something he had to do outside. Over the years, the sightings continued. Sometimes she would appear for just a second, her face pale in the moonlight before vanishing. Other times she lingered, her hand pressed flat against the glass, her head tilting as if she were studying me. No matter what, she never came inside. She only ever watched. By the time I was a teenager, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe reflections, maybe shadows from the trees outside. I avoided the window, refused to look at it after dark. But one summer, when I was 16, everything changed. I was staying at my grandparents' house for a week while my parents were away. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the hallway. The house was silent, the only sound the distant hum of cicadas through the open window downstairs. I tried not to look at the glass, but curiosity won. She was there, but this time she wasn't outside. She was inside the house, standing on my side of the glass, her figure sharp and clear in the dim light. Her face was pale, her eyes too dark, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak. I stumbled back, slamming against the wall, but when I blinked, she was gone again. My heart hammered in my chest as I whispered to myself that it was a dream, just a dream. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I confronted my grandmother. I told her exactly what I had seen. For a long moment, she was silent, her wrinkled hands trembling as she folded laundry at the table. Then she said something that chilled me to the bone. "You must never open that window. Do you understand?" Never. She wouldn't explain further, no matter how much I begged. My grandfather still refused to say anything at all. The warning only made my fear worse. Every time I passed that hallway, I felt eyes on me. That final night of my stay, I woke up to a sound. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay frozen in bed, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway. I forced myself to get up, every step heavy, my throat dry. As I turned the corner, I saw her again, the woman at the window, but she wasn't standing still this time. She was moving. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand and beckoned me closer. My heart thundered as I shook my head, whispering no. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time I heard something, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, but I swear it came from her. "Let me in." I bolted back to my room, slammed the door and hid under the covers like I was a child again. I didn't sleep until the sun rose. The next day I insisted on leaving early, calling my parents to pick me up. I never stayed overnight in that house again. Years later, when my grandparents passed away, the house was left empty. My parents wanted to sell it, but it sat on the market for months with no buyers. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back one last time. The house was just as I remembered, quiet, dusty, filled with shadows. As I walked up the staircase, my stomach churned. The hallway window waited at the top, its warped glass glinting faintly in the dim light. For a long time I stood there, debating whether to look. Finally, I forced myself. At first I saw nothing but my own reflection. Then, slowly, a shape formed behind me in the glass. A pale face, hollow eyes, lips curving into that same faint smile. My blood turned to ice as I spun around. No one was there. But when I turned back to the glass, she was closer. Her hand pressed against the window, her whisper brushing against my ear even though the room was empty. "Let me in." I ran out of that house and never returned. To this day, I don't know who she was or what she wanted. All I know is that some nights, when I wake to silence, I hear faint tapping on my own bedroom window. And no matter how strong the temptation, I never, ever look. Driving at night has never really bothered me. Some people hate the darkness of the road, the way the headlights carve out a narrow tunnel of vision, while everything else disappears into black. But for me, the quiet of the highway was comforting. It felt like the world belonged only to me, the hum of the tires a steady rhythm beneath the night sky. That comfort ended one night on a stretch of road I'll never forget. It was late, maybe past midnight when I left work. The office had kept me longer than expected, and the only route home was a 2-lane highway cutting through farmland and woods. There were no streetlights, only the occasional glow from a distant farmhouse window or the reflection of my headlights bouncing back from a road sign. I remember rolling down the window slightly, letting the cool air in, the smell of cut grass and soil drifting through. The road was empty, just me and the dark. That's when I noticed it. At first I thought it was just the sound of the wind, but then I realized I was hearing something else. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing that wasn't mine. My chest tightened, and instinctively I glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing. The back seat was empty, just a pile of papers and my jacket tossed to one side. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Long shifts and exhaustion do strange things to the mind. But then, At the next curve in the road, my headlights caught something in the glass. A reflection. For a fraction of a second, I saw the pale outline of a face in the back seat, just behind my shoulder. My heart lurched and I slammed the brakes so hard the car skidded, tires screeching on the asphalt. When I whipped around, the seat was empty. My jacket sat undisturbed, the papers fluttering slightly from the sudden stop. I sat there in the middle of that deserted road, engine idling, hands shaking on the wheel. Finally, I convinced myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light. I took a deep breath, put the car back in gear, and kept driving. But the breathing came back, louder this time. And when I glanced at the mirror again, I didn't just see the shape of a face. I saw eyes, dark, hollow eyes staring straight into mine through the reflection. I didn't stop this time. I just pressed harder on the gas, my hands gripping the wheels so tight they ached. I could feel the weight of someone in the back seat now, the faint pressure of the cushions shifting, the sound of fabric rustling as if someone had leaned forward. My throat went dry, every instinct screaming at me not to turn around. Then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, but close enough that it felt like someone's lips were almost brushing my ear. Keep driving. I nearly swerved off the road. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my chest pounding with every heartbeat. The voice was low, calm but heavy with something I couldn't describe. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the more I tried to block it out, the louder it seemed to get. Don't stop. The road stretched on endlessly, each mile blending into the next. I drove faster than I ever had before, desperate to see another car, another person, anything that would break the isolation. But the highway remained empty, a ribbon of darkness and silence stretching ahead. Then, without warning, the voice changed. It was no longer calm, it was urgent. Don't look. Of course, that's exactly what I did. Against every ounce of reason, I glanced into the rearview mirror. She was there, a woman, pale as bone, sitting in the back seat. Her hair was long and tangled, her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was her eyes that froze me in place. Two black voids, endless and empty, pulling me in like a tide. I slammed the brakes again, the car jerking to a stop in the middle of the highway. I spun around, ready to face her, ready to fight or flee. The back seat was empty. I sat there for what felt like forever, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Eventually, I forced myself to start driving again, this time slower, whispering prayers under my breath. By the time I reached the lights of the city, my body was trembling, sweat soaking my shirt. For weeks afterward, I couldn't bring myself to drive at night. I took longer routes, stayed later at work, even slept in my office to avoid that highway. But avoidance only lasts so long. The first night I forced myself back on the road, I thought I had beaten it. The ride was quiet, uneventful. No whispers, no shadows, no breathing but my own. Relief washed over me as the miles passed. I was almost home when I stopped at a red light. Absent-mindedly, I glanced into the rearview mirror. She was sitting there, directly behind me, closer than before. Her lips barely moved, but I heard the whisper clear as day. Keep driving. When my uncle passed away, the family inherited his old farmhouse. It sat on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that hadn't been ploughed in decades and trees that had grown wild around the property. The place had been in the family for generations, but no one really wanted to live there. It was too far from everything, too outdated, too heavy with memories. Still, when my parents decided to fix it up and maybe sell it, I offered to help. The first time I walked through the front door, I was struck by how stale the air felt. like the house had been holding its breath for years. The wallpaper was peeling, the floors sagged in places, and the furniture looked like it had been left exactly as my uncle had last used it. A coffee cup still sat on the table, coated in dust. His boots were by the door. It felt less like an abandoned home and more like a place frozen in time. For the first few days, everything was normal. I scrubbed the floors, boxed up his belongings, and tried not to dwell on the strange feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. But then I noticed something odd. The house had 5 windows visible from the outside upstairs, but when I walked through the second floor, there were only 4 rooms. I double-checked, counted again. But no matter how many times I walked the hallway, there was no 5th room. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. One night, I brought it up to my parents, who dismissed it as me miscounting. But I knew what I saw. A missing room, a window that didn't belong. The next day, I started tapping on the walls. In the upstairs hallway, between the guest bedroom and what used to be my uncle's study, the walls sounded hollow. My pulse quickened. I pressed my ear against it and thought I heard something faint, like a low hum, too steady to be in my head. My hands shook as I traced the edges of the wallpaper, looking for a seam, a hidden door, anything. Eventually, I found it. A small outline, almost invisible beneath layers of faded wallpaper. With a knife, I cut carefully, peeling back the paper until I saw the faint lines of a door frame. My heart was pounding as I pressed against it, and to my shock, it opened. The room beyond was small, maybe the size of a closet, but it wasn't empty. There was a bed, neatly made as if someone had just stepped out, a dresser, a chair, and on the nightstand a glass of water that hadn't collected a single speck of dust. The air in that room felt different, warmer, almost humid, like it had been lived in even though it was sealed away. I stood frozen in the doorway, dread spreading through me. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The faint hum I had heard before grew louder, and I realized it wasn't a hum at all, it was breathing. Slow, steady breathing coming from the corner of the room. I turned my head slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to look, but I couldn't help it. There, in the shadows, sat a figure. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it shifted. Shoulders rising, head tilting, someone was sitting in that chair. I stumbled back, slamming the hidden door shut, my chest heaving. I told myself it was exhaustion, dust making me dizzy, my imagination filling in the rest. I didn't open that door again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old farmhouse set me on edge. Around midnight, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. The problem was, the room above me didn't exist on the floor plan. It was the hidden room. I buried myself under the covers, telling myself it wasn't real. But when morning came, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the hidden room was slightly ajar. I told my parents we needed to leave the house. I didn't explain why, just insisted. They rolled their eyes, but finally agreed to wrap things up early. Before we left, I went upstairs one last time, determined to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. The hidden door was wide open. The bed was still neatly made. The dresser still stood in the corner, but the chair was empty. On the nightstand, next to the glass of water, sat a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were 3 words: "Thanks for staying." I left the house that day and never went back. The farmhouse was eventually sold, and I don't know who lives there now. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear that faint breathing again, steady and patient, like someone waiting in the corner of my own room. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to subscribe for more chilling tales. Drop a like if you enjoyed, and share your thoughts or your own scary experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear them.